I think to myself, is there ever anything important that can happen in Washington? Is there ever anything I can do to save some of the millions of children that are dying in Yemen? This is it. This is this debate today. It isn't about an arms sale. It's about children like Ali who died. Why are they dying? Because the Soviets have blockaded the ports. 90% of Yemen's food comes in from the ocean, and they can get no food, and they are starving and dying of cholera because of war. We think of famine being related to the weather. Sometimes it is. But more often than not, famine is related to man, is man-made, and the most common cause is war. How bad is it in Yemen? 17 million people live on the edge of starvation. Some, like Ali, have already died. What are people saying about it? They say that the humanitarian crisis in Yemen may be worse than Syria. Let me repeat that, because nobody in America is listening to this. Everybody's paying attention to some silly show trials and silly stuff going on in committees. Nobody's talking about this at all. They say it is worse than Syria. Millions of people have fled Syria. Hundreds of thousands have died, and people are now predicting Yemen may be worse. One refugee group said this, that the impending famine in Yemen may reach biblical proportions. Think about that. It's astounding what's going on there, and it's being done without your permission, but with your weapons. So today I will force a vote with Senator Murphy's help, who's been a prime mover in this, to tell you the truth, and done a great job in bringing people together. But we will force this vote for these children in Yemen, because we have a chance today to stop the carnage. We have a chance to tell Saudi Arabia we've had enough. The question is, should we give money or arms to Saudi Arabia at all? What has Saudi Arabia done over the last 30 years? They have been the #1 exporter of jihadist philosophy, the #1 exporter of let's hate America, let's hate Judeo-Christian ethic, let's hate the Judeo-Christian tradition. It's coming from Saudi Arabia. They teach it in the schools in our country. They teach it in the schools in Indonesia. They corrupt the religion of Islam throughout the world. And we're going to give them weapons? I think it's a huge, huge mistake. If you say, well, I doubt that, there's no way they're that bad. Don't they share with us intelligence? Don't they help us in the war on terror? Yes, every time they help us, they hurt us twofold worse. I'll give you an example. Direct from Hillary Clinton, when she's writing honestly and not talking to the public. She sends an email to John Podesta. This is one that was leaked through WikiLeaks. Hillary Clinton writing to John Podesta. She says, we must put pressure on Saudi Arabia and Qatar because they're supplying logistical and financial support to ISIL. ISIS, the group are in the Middle East fighting again. Saudi Arabia was supplying them, according to Hillary Clinton, not indirectly, but directly. Who in their right mind would give money, arms, or share our technology with a country that's been supporting ISIS? Who would do that? Who would think that that's a good idea? And yet they'll come here and they'll say it's about Iran and we have to combat Iran everywhere. Guess what? This may make the situation with Iran worse. What do you think Iran thinks when Saudi Arabia gets weapons? They think to themselves, well, if the Saudis are getting more, we need more. What do you think Israel thinks? If the Saudis get more, we need more. Ever heard of an arms race? That's what this is. We are fueling an arms race in the Middle East. Every side wants more. And you say, well, we have to do this. We have to combat Iran. You know how much the Gulf sheikdoms, Saudi Arabia and all their allies, the ones that are bombing the hell out of Yemen, do you know how their military spending compares to Iran? 8-1. All of the money is in the Gulf sheikdoms. All of the power, all of the weapons is in the Gulf sheikdoms. They have more weapons and spend more on weapons, 8-1 to Iran. So when we're going to vote on Iran sanctions this week, and they say they don't want ballistic missiles in Iran. Well, I don't either. But the best way to do that is to put pressure on Saudi Arabia. How would you put pressure on Saudi Arabia? Maybe we wouldn't sell them arms. Maybe we would withhold the sale of arms until they come to the table and we get a ballistic agreement with Iran. It is a naive and foolish notion to think that Iran's going to give up on their ballistic weapons. They are never giving up on their ballistic weapons unless Saudi Arabia did the same thing. People don't talk about this, but Saudi Arabia has ballistic missiles. They've got Chinese missiles. They're called the Dengfang 21 and 3. They have dozens of these. Do you know where they're pointed? Tehran and Tel Aviv. So Saudi Arabia is no friend of Israel. Do they cooperate with Israel some? Yes. But their missiles are pointed at Tel Aviv, Israel. Saudi Arabia's other missiles are pointed at Tehran. Are these missiles nuclear capable? Yes. They're not thought to be nuclear tipped, meaning they haven't been armed with nuclear missiles, but everyone who is in the arms community acknowledges that these missiles could carry a nuclear payload if they were altered. They have the ability to do it. Should we send arms to Saudi Arabia? Well, here's another quote from Bob Graham, and this is a paraphrase. He says that there's an abundance of evidence that the Saudis were complicit in 9/11. Have we forgotten that 15 out of the 19 hijackers were from Saudi Arabia? Have we forgotten the missing 28 pages that they kept from the American public for over a decade? When you read those missing 28 pages that have now been released, they tend to implicate Saudi Arabia. They tend to indicate that the attackers, particularly in San Diego, were befriended by a government agent for Saudi Arabia. There's an abundance of information that implicates Saudi Arabia in 9/11. In fact, this very Congress voted less than a year ago. We voted unanimously, or virtually unanimously, to let American citizens, the victims of 9/11, their families, we voted to let them sue Saudi Arabia. This is an extraordinary thing. We almost never let people sue governments, particularly foreign governments. But we voted nearly unanimously. Why? Because people have sympathy still for the 9/11 victims and their family. And because people obviously believe there's some information that may implicate Saudi Arabia. So you say, oh, no, they've changed. Well, how much could they have changed? It's only a year or two ago, Hillary Clinton's writing that email saying the Saudis are giving financial and logistical support to ISIL. Who in their right mind would sell arms to Saudi Arabia under those circumstances? So if it doesn't persuade you that the Saudis are supporting ISIL and terrorism, may have been part of 9/11, perhaps we should look not only at the humanitarian disaster in Yemen and what they're doing to the public, and that their goal basically is famine to bring them to submission. Perhaps we should look at Saudi Arabia as a country. Perhaps we should look at the human rights record of Saudi Arabia. I'll give you a couple of instances of what it's like to live in Saudi Arabia. There was a young girl who was 19 years old. They haven't named her because her story is so traumatic. She was 19 years old. They call her the girl of Qatif. She was 19 years old and she was raped by 7 men. Now, the men were punished, a couple years in prison. But you know what happened? They arrested the victim. Because you see, in Saudi Arabia, it's your fault if you're raped. In Saudi Arabia, rape victims are arrested, put in prison, and publicly whipped. She was given 6 months in prison, and 200 lashes was her sentence. Ultimately, it did not come to fore. And you know why? Partly because the U.S. stood up and said it was wrong. Partly because perhaps behind the scenes we said, maybe we're not going to sell you weapons if you behave like a bunch of barbarians. I'll tell you another story. Ali al-Nimr, he's a Shiite. The Middle East is somewhat divided between Sunni and Shia. So he's a Shiite. They're about 10% of the public in Saudi Arabia. They are the minority, and they are treated like dirt. His uncle was a sheikh, and by all accounts, one who called for peaceful elections, who wasn't an advocate of violence, never was known or seen to have a weapon, but was executed by the Saudis for leading protest. Executed for standing up in front of people and saying, we should have elections, we should not have this authoritarian government that lords it over us and does not allow us even to practice our religion in public. Ali's uncle was beheaded. Ali was 17 at the time. It was the beginning of the Arab Spring, and Ali got excited and motivated. And if you see the pictures of him, it's heartbreaking. You see pictures of him in Western clothing. He liked poetry. He liked music. He was by all means the kind of people that we wish would come to leadership in Saudi Arabia. But at 17, he went to a rally, and he chose to be part of the Arab Spring to say, we don't want authoritarianism. We don't want despots. We don't want kings and all of their hereditary lording it over us. We want elections. And for that, he was arrested and put on death row. And death row, and Saudi Arabia being Saudi Arabia, the death row includes beheading and crucifixion. That will be his sentence, beheading and crucifixion. This is the regime that you're being asked to send weapons to. People say, oh, they're buying them. The technology is ours. It's American technology that was developed for the defense of this country, and the companies would never have the technology had we not paid them to have it. The American taxpayer has a right to that technology, and while almost every other good in the marketplace, I would say the government has no right to tell you who you sell it to, arms are different because they're all developed by the U.S. taxpayer. And I do believe there should be rules about who gets our arms. I don't think we should sell them to Saudi Arabia if they might wind up in the hands of ISIS. I don't think we should sell them to Saudi Arabia if they punish people for protest, if they punish people for speaking out by beheading them and crucifying them. I'm not for selling them a rifle, much less precision-guided missiles. Now, some will say, oh, if we give them more accurate missiles, they'll kill less civilians. That presumes that they're not targeting civilians. You think it was a mistake? You think they accidentally bombed a funeral procession? You think their intelligence was so bad they didn't know it was a funeral procession? They killed 125 people at a funeral. They wounded 500. We wonder about why we have so much terrorism. Some, yes, they hate us maybe inherently, but some of it's blowback to policy. Some of it is, do you think the people who died or the people that survived or the relatives of those who died in that funeral procession, you think they're ever going to forget it? They will remember it 100 years from now. The problem we face of terrorism goes on and on and on as long as we keep supporting despots who treat their people like crap, who sentence them to beheading and crucifixion, who are starving their neighboring country, which is one of the poorest nations on the planet Earth. We are not getting better. We are not getting any closer to peace by supporting the Saudis. It's a huge mistake. The girl of Qatif, rape victim, sentenced to prison and lashes, 70 lashes. Ali al-Nimr, still on death row, sentenced to beheading and crucifixion. Raif Badawi, what is he? I don't know much about him, but he's an outspoken blogger. Somebody who writes his opinion and may have opinions that may not be orthodox. But for that, the Saudis arrested him, and he's in jail for 10 years, and he's sentenced to 1,000 lashes. I don't think you can survive 1,000 lashes, so the Saudis, in their great humanity, are dividing his treatment into 10 doses. He's already had 100 publicly applied. He has 900 more to go. Shouldn't we think a little bit about supplying arms to this country? If the human rights aspect to this is not enough, I think we should probably think about the region. There is a problem in the Middle East. There is conflict. Some of it goes very deep. Those who live in the Middle East remember the Battle of Karbala in 680 AD, when a grandson of Muhammad and a caliph came together and had a battle. They still remember, and they're still unhappy about a battle from 680. They have long memories. I'm reminded of what one Afghan told a reporter or a soldier recently. He says, you have all the watches, but we have all the time. They live there and have for centuries, and we'll be there when we have gone. They have to fix their own problems. We can occasionally say we're going to help some people destroy an evil empire, or an evil group like ISIS. Yes. But the people fighting and the people on the ground need to be the people who live there. It can't be foreigners. It can't be people who they consider to be pagans. It's never going to work. But we are foolish if we don't look at the repercussions of what it means to sell arms to Saudi Arabia. How will Iran react? I was in a committee hearing the other day, and one of the senators says, we don't care how Iran reacts. We don't care what they think. Well, by golly, we ought to. If we're going to put sanctions on them, doesn't that mean we care enough that we're trying to modulate and change their behavior? The whole idea of sanctions means we do care about what Iran thinks. Doesn't mean we agree with it. Doesn't mean we condone it. Doesn't mean we say Iran is right, but certainly we do care about what they think. So what do you think Iran thinks about supplying arms to Saudi Arabia? They think we need more. If you add up Saudi arms alone are third biggest in the world now. It's U.S., as big as the next 10 combined, then it's China, and then it's Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia has these other Gulf sheikdoms, despots. They're all allies of ours. There's about 5 or 6 of them. Altogether, they have 8 times more weapons than Iran. And so we're complaining, I think justifiably so, because we worry about the mischief of Iran in the Middle East. But we're complaining about that, and we want them to change their behavior. But what do you think is the prime reason they create weapons and they're creating their ballistic missiles? Some of it's because they fear our invasion, like Iraq. But I think a great deal of why Iran develops weapons is their fear of Saudi Arabia. In fact, when you look back at Iraq and the whole weapons of mass destruction that never existed, one of the interesting stories is, maybe a theory, but I think has some evidence, is that Saddam Hussein pretended valiantly that he had weapons of mass destruction, not to deter us, to deter Iran. So here is Saddam Hussein sending all these smoke signals up that he has weapons of mass destruction because he wants to keep Iran at bay. We think everything's about us, and we never acknowledge that maybe some of it's about the regional politics. So when we give weapons or sell weapons to Saudi Arabia, there will be, for every action or reaction, there will be significantly more pressure for Iran to come forward and have more weapons. What does it do to our ally Israel? There's been at least a few reports that says Israel believes that every time we give $1 to Saudi Arabia, they need to respond with $1.50. There was a quote from one of their government ministers on this saying he worries about their qualitative edge. I have a quote here from a colleague of mine, a friend of mine who's a rabbi and a friend of the Constitution. Rabbi Nate Siegel writes, "While I understand the president's intentions, we must proceed with great caution due to the challenges and the history of the region. At this time, I don't see the benefits of the arms deal for the United States or Israel." This is coming from someone who believes with every fiber of his being that Israel should be defended. He's worried that by giving weapons to Saudi Arabia, it detracts from the qualitative edge that Israel currently has. Imagine what happens if the government of Saudi Arabia were overthrown. They have billions and billions of dollars of weapons. Many of these weapons are the most sophisticated weapons we have. Is there a chance they could be overthrown? Well, I don't know. They behead their citizens and crucify them. You think anybody who lives in Saudi Arabia might have some pent-up anger for the regime? William Wilberforce once said of slavery, he said, "Having heard all this, you can look the other way. But you can never say that you didn't know." I love that statement because so many people at the time of slavery looked away. They just said, it's something we do. It's part of our time. It's part of our age. And so many people knew the horror of slavery. So many people knew the horror of what was happening to a people, and they looked away. I think having heard of the impending famine in Yemen, having seen Ali and having heard of the impending famine, you can choose to look away. Many in this body will today choose to look away. They will say, you know what? Yeah, Saudi Arabia gives us some benefits sometime, and we hate Iran more. So let's just give some more weapons to Saudi Arabia. But they will be looking away from the human rights tragedy that is central to Saudi Arabia's whole being. They will be looking away from the fact that Saudi Arabia was supporting ISIS in the Syrian civil war. They will be looking away from the fact that the Saudi blockade is starving Yemeni children. You know what? I choose not to look away. And today I stand up for the thousands of civilians who are being killed in Yemen. Today I stand up for the millions of voiceless children in Yemen who will be killed by the Saudi blockade. Today I stand up for saying we, the United States, should no longer be fueling the arms race in the Middle East. It's come to no good. The wars and the rage and the anger are thousands of years old. We will never get to the bottom of it. We should defend ourselves at all costs. We should be very careful who is admitted into the country. And we should not get involved in every civil war and every misbegotten part of the planet. It is my hope and my prayer that enough Americans will wake up and say, we are tired of war. We are tired of funding every war on the globe, and we are tired of sacrificing our young in every civil war. Today, this will be a bipartisan vote. There will be a large contingent from the other side of the aisle and a small contingent from this side. But this is important. This is a rare day in Senate history where we actually have the chance to stop an evil. But we would stop this evil by sending a loud message to the president and a loud message to Saudi Arabia that we are not going to blindly support the arms race. We are not going to be blind to your human rights transgressions, and we are not going to blindly give you weapons in the face of beheading your citizens and crucifying them. So today I take a stand for those who do not have a voice, and I hope the Senate will think long and hard and will vote against this arms sale to Saudi Arabia.
Mr. President.